12-year-old Jordan couldn't contain his excitement as he stepped into the terminal, clutching his boarding pass. This wasn't just any trip, it was his first international flight. A kid who adored airplanes, he'd spent the past few weeks devouring travel videos, memorizing flight paths, and imagining the thrill of flying above the clouds. Now, today, it was all real. His mother, Camille, walked beside him, adjusting the strap of her handbag. She smiled as she watched her son's eyes dart from one departure screen to another, unable to hide his excitement. "You're going to wear yourself out before we even get on the plane," she teased, nudging him gently. Jordan barely heard her, his focus fixed on the Boeing 787 Dreamliner parked at the gate. "It's so much bigger in person," he whispered, in awe. Passengers were already lining up by boarding group, but Jordan's ticket was different. For the first time in his life, he wasn't in economy. His father had splurged on first-class seats for both of them. "This is going to be amazing," he muttered, almost bursting with excitement as they moved toward the priority boarding lane. Skipping the long lines made him feel important, like one of those business travelers in fancy suits. At the entrance, a flight attendant greeted passengers with a polite smile. Jordan practically bounced with joy as he handed over his boarding pass, practically unwrapping it like a Christmas gift. The scanner beeped, and the attendant glanced down at his ticket and then at him. "Welcome aboard," she said, handing it back. As he stepped onto the plane, Jordan's excitement faltered for just a moment. Something felt off, like a switch had been flipped. He entered the cabin, and his breath caught in his throat. The first-class section was like another world: wide leather recliners, personal screens, and attendants moving with quiet grace. It smelled of fresh linen and citrus, a stark contrast to the cramped economy sections he was used to. When he found his seat, right by the window, he was nearly floating with joy. But just as he reached it, a flight attendant in a crisp navy uniform stepped in his path. "Excuse me, young man," she said, her polished smile never reaching her eyes. "This section is for first-class passengers only." Jordan thought she was joking. Maybe she'd mistaken him for someone else. "I am in first class," he said confidently, showing her his ticket. Her smile thinned. "Where did you get this ticket?" The words hit Jordan like a punch. "My dad got it for me," he said, confused. "It's my seat." Instead of stepping aside, the attendant turned to the galley. "One moment," she murmured, calling another crew member over. Jordan stood frozen, feeling the eyes of the passengers on him. Some were already whispering. He could feel their judgment, their suspicion, and it made his stomach churn. His mother wasn't with him. She'd gone to the restroom before boarding, and he wished, more than anything, that she were here with him now. The second flight attendant, an older man, approached and scanned Jordan's ticket with an unreadable expression. "Let me check with the front desk," he said. "Please stay here." Jordan's hands clenched around the boarding pass. He couldn't believe what was happening. This was his seat, there was no mistake, but the way everyone was looking at him made him feel like an imposter. "Excuse me," a middle-aged man in a grey suit spoke up from across the aisle. "Maybe it's just a misunderstanding. You know, they have to be careful with security these days." Jordan's stomach dropped. His mother's voice interrupted the tension as her heels clicked down the aisle, her eyes flicking between the flight attendant and Jordan. "What's going on here?" The flight attendant turned to her with a tight smile. "We're just verifying your son's seat assignment. There seems to be a mix-up." Camille's gaze never wavered. She calmly took Jordan's ticket from him and handed it to the flight attendant. "This isn't a mix-up," she said. "My son is in seat 4A. The older flight attendant returned at that moment, still holding the ticket. "We weren't able to find an issue with the booking," he said, his voice uncertain. The first flight attendant hesitated but didn't back down. "Maybe the system made a mistake." "Could it be an upgrade that wasn't processed properly?" Camille's brow furrowed. "An upgrade?" she repeated, disbelief in her voice. Jordan's stomach twisted. They were still questioning him, still questioning whether he belonged there. If there was an issue, Camille continued, her tone sharp, why wasn't it brought up at the gate? My ticket was scanned just like everyone else's. There was a tense silence as the crew exchanged uncertain glances. The weight of the whispers in the cabin grew heavier, and Jordan could feel the heat of the passengers' stares. His mother turned to him, sit down, baby. Jordan slid into his seat, the feeling of relief washing over him at least for a moment. But then, the businessman across from him spoke again. Maybe it's just a misunderstanding, he said lightly. They have to be careful about security, you know. Jordan's stomach churned. His mother's eyes flicked to the man, and for a moment, everything went still. Oh, I see, she said, her voice smooth. And what exactly are they securing my son from? The businessman faltered, unable to reply, and quickly looked away. Jordan exhaled deeply, his heart slowing. This wasn't over, but Camille had already handled it. Just as the tension seemed to lift, another voice interrupted. Jordan froze, his father's deep voice cutting through the air. What seems to be the issue here? Malcolm Hayes entered the aisle, his presence commanding attention. The air seemed to shift. His father's authority was undeniable. His measured words cut through the murmurs as he asked again, what's the issue? The supervisor and flight attendant stood frozen, the realization dawning on them. Malcolm Hayes wasn't just a businessman. He was the owner of the airline. I just got off a call with the regional manager, he said smoothly, slipping his phone back into his pocket. She'll be very interested to hear about the way my wife and son were treated today. The supervisor visibly paled. I think she'll want to discuss it with someone higher up, maybe corporate, Malcolm added casually. Seeing as how I own the airline. The entire cabin seemed to freeze, and a few passengers audibly gasped. Camille smirked, turning to Jordan. You okay now, baby? Jordan nodded, but his father's words lingered in his mind. It wasn't about the money or status, it was about knowing who you are. Son, his father said, sitting across the aisle, talk to me. Jordan hesitated before asking, would this have happened if I looked different? His father's gaze softened. You already know the answer. Jordan swallowed hard, nodding slowly. He did know. Camille exhaled, shaking her head. You were just a kid sitting in a seat you paid for. And yet somehow that wasn't enough. The lesson was clear. The world could judge him based on what they saw, but Jordan was learning how to stand tall. As the plane taxied down the runway, Jordan leaned back in his seat. He had already learned something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He belonged. And no one could ever take that away from him. Jordan might have boarded as a boy, but he was leaving as someone who knew his worth, stronger, wiser, and ready to face whatever came next. The flight attendants, and even some of the passengers, had learned a thing or two today too. And maybe that was the real lesson. Never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. If you found this story thought-provoking or inspiring, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it.